Hey guys, VentuRen here and welcome to today's video, which is going to be a theory of The Last of Us timeline so far. What this video is going to include is the Last of Us comics, all 4 chapters, the DLC Left Behind, the original base game, The Last of Us, and of course the 3 trailers that we have so far for The Last of Us Part 2. It's important that you know this as there is going to be spoilers for every single one of those in this video. But now that's cleared up, let's get onto the theory of the timeline. So the first thing in The Last of Us timeline does seem to come from the original base game, The Last of Us, and this is the first part of the game that you ever get to experience. This is where you're with Sarah and Joel and Uncle Tommy right at the beginning of the game, and you are where the infection first started, the night that it started to blow up, essentially, and people were obviously being infected in the cities, and unfortunately we see Sarah die. That is the first point in the timeline that we get to set off this adventure that we will spend hours on and pour our hearts into. What I believe to be next in the timeline is the second trailer that we ever got for The Last of Us Part 2. This trailer consisted of the cult-type group, those 2 characters that we hadn't yet seen before, and of course, the woman who everyone believed to be Ellie's mum, Anna. The reason this comes next is because obviously if that is Ellie's mum, then we know that she gave birth during the whole scenario, as Ellie talks about in the first game, how she's been born into this, she's never had a life outside of this. We also see in that trailer that the cult type group is holding a sort of knife or shiv to who we think is Anna, Ellie's mum's stomach, and is saying something to do with the child, so that is all the evidence that I have for that coming next in the timeline. Now, next up, we have something that not everyone who knows The Last of Us might have been lucky enough to read or experience. The Last of Us comics, they're absolutely fantastic, and if you can find them ever on eBay or somewhere like that, I do recommend you pick them up. In this comic, it is split up into 4 chapters. Chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. They don't have subnames, they're just called Chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in the first chapter, this is when we meet Riley for the first time, and the viewpoint of the comic is on Ellie. So you're still set on Ellie's viewpoint. In Chapter 2, we do see relationships between the Last of Us Left Behind DLC and the comic book. Within it, we see environments from the DLC in the comic, and we actually see the man called Winston for the first time in this comic. So those of you who've played the DLC will know that when you're in the mall that Riley takes you to, you come up against this yellow tent and you go and you have this little conversation about Winston, and they talk about his horse, and they actually know him prior to that event, so that is why the comics definitely come next. In Chapter 3, Riley steals Winston's radio and his smoke grenades. This sort of gets referenced very slightly, and they do put a little Easter egg in The Last of Us Left Behind DLC for those who have read the comic. But other than that, there is no other feature of the game in that part of the comic. Then, moving on to Chapter 4, the final chapter of the comic, we meet Marlene for the first time. Both Riley and Ellie meet Marlene and the Fireflies, who are fighting some smugglers. This is where Marlene actually talks to Ellie for the first time ever, and what's interesting about this is Ellie knew nothing about her mother prior to this meeting, but Marlene actually tells her in this moment when she recognises Ellie that her mum's name is Anna. This is the first time Ellie ever finds anything out about her mum, and Marlene is the one to tell Ellie. For those of you who haven't read the comics, I hope that made some sense, and we'll move on to the next step in the timeline. The next part of the timeline is actually the Last of Us Left Behind DLC. Specifically, the Riley and Ellie parts of the Last of Us Left Behind DLC are next, going in order of Riley scaring Ellie at the beginning of the game, then when they go to the mall and go to the yellow tent where Winston lives and have the alcohol conversation, then going to the Halloween shop and trying on all the masks. Then they throw bricks at all the cars, and after you either win or lose that, you go to the section of the mall with the carnival ride. You then can pick up the joke book, and then you go to the photo booth if you wish, which is so adorable. I love that moment. After that, you have a bit of awkward tension, but you fight it out with some water guns. Then, of course, we have that ever so sweet kiss scene, which is so delightful, but it is tragically followed by the unfortunate bite of both Riley and Ellie, and then obviously Riley's death, which is heartbreaking, but that is how that part of the timeline goes. After all that, we jump back to the original The Last of Us base game, where it says it is summer and we are 20 years later on from Sarah's death. In this section, we go on our travels with Tess and we find Marlene, who then leads us to Ellie, and the journey really begins. We continue with Tess for a little while until she also reaches an unfortunate fate and dies, sort of gives herself in a firearms fight. Then we head to a guy called Billy who gave Joel and Ellie some help on their way because apparently he owed Joel a favour. They get the car going and off they go to travel across the land. Eventually they do get ambushed on the road by another group and they get stuck in the city for a little while, and this is where we meet Sam and Henry. But unfortunately, once again, we have Sam get bitten and get infected, and Henry just can't take it. His older brother, he can't take it, and he does in fact end his own life. I'm sure everyone can agree that that was a really emotional moment and it was really impactful, and I just felt horrible. But this does transition into the next part of the game where it comes up and says we're in fall. In this section of the game, we actually happen to stumble across Tommy's place, which is a great moment. It's nice to see some reunions happening there. However, Ellie does overhear that Joel doesn't think he can take her any further. He doesn't know if he can stay with Ellie anymore and reach this objective that they've been going towards. I mean, they've already lost a lot of people. He lost Tess as well, this big impactful person in his life. But this leads to Ellie running off. Eventually, after a mini argument, Ellie does finally agree to go back with Joel, and though she doesn't agree with the decision of Tommy taking her, she does go back with him on the horses. However, Joel decides that no, he's not going to leave Ellie after all, and they continue on their journey. Though this seems all great and fantastic that the two haven't left each other, it is The Last of Us, and this is when we have a pretty big fight scene where we thought we might have found the fireflies, but we don't find them, and this is where Joel actually gets wounded. He falls off a balcony and gets impaled with a spike, if you remember, and he is very, very sick. This leads us to the next part of the timeline, which is the Last of Us Left Behind DLC. The part exclusively where Ellie is trying to find supplies for Joel, and she goes around this massive building. She eventually finds some medicine and tries to get out. I always thought that was a really good part to include in a DLC because of course Ellie would have been alone during that time, and how did Joel recover? It had to be Ellie who found the materials. So that section is next, and we're done with the DLC now for the timeline. Then we jump back to The Last of Us base game and we are in winter now. This is when Ellie is still alone. In an attempt to get some food or medicine, she leaves Joel for a little while, and that's when we bump into David, which turns into this massive spiral where David becomes the antagonist of the game. This leads to David and his group wanting Joel dead because they find out how many of his men that Joel has killed along with Ellie, but he actually wants to spare Ellie originally. However, she does end up in a cage on their grounds, but of course she breaks free and runs into the wintry wilderness. After a short while you actually find a building to go into, and this is where we have the sort of big boss fight of the game against one individual character. The next part of the timeline is still with the Last of Us base game, but we move into the season of spring. In this final season of the game, we have this heartwarming journey to where they might finally reach the Firefly Hospital, and it's going quite well until, of course, Ellie and Joel fall into the water, and Ellie needs CPR to be revived. She needs to get the water out, and Joel gets knocked out. This is where the Fireflies attempt to take Ellie without Joel's permission and extract the infection. However, we know that it will kill Ellie if they go through with this procedure. This leads into the massive final area where you're fighting tons of enemies. It feels insane, it feels extremely immersive, and we have the situation where we pick up Ellie, we take her, we get the hell out of there, and you actually kill Marlene. Once Ellie wakes up in the back of the car, we choose to tell her that nothing could have been done, and this is where we have a loading screen and we go into the final stages of The Last of Us base game. Just before we reach the end cutscene, we can see that we're heading back to Tommy's. As far as I'm aware, that's where we were going, and Ellie then finally spills about everything that she's been keeping inside. She talks about Riley, she talks about Tess, Sam, and everyone who she's known who has perished on this journey. Then she asks Joel to promise to her that there was absolutely nothing that could have been done, and Joel guarantees her that what he did was basically the only option. This is the final part of The Last of Us game, and we all get that bittersweet feeling of finishing a game, but also that sorrow of knowing that we can't continue this adventure yet with these two characters. Moving on to the final bit of the timeline that we pretty much can put together is the third trailer we actually got at E3 this year, 2018. The cinematic part of that trailer shows that Ellie is now in a community, and we know because we've been told that this is 4 years on from the original game. In this scene we meet two new characters called Jesse and one called Dina. It pretty much confirms that Joel is also there and is going to be in the game, but what's interesting is this dance we have with Dina and the kiss that we share. On her hand is a bracelet. This small little feature of the bracelet is why I think the trailers follow in this order, because I think it is a pre to what's going to come in the next two trailers. Now these two last ones that I want to talk about for the timeline could go either way. There might be some debate about this in the comments, or you might disagree, which is perfectly fine. But what I would say would go next would be the third Last of Us Part 2 trailer that we have so far, again from E3, but specifically the gameplay from that trailer. So in it we see that Ellie is in fact wearing the bracelet. I touched on this in another video, I'll link it down below, when I went through the in-depth details of the gameplay and what I thought was going on, but she is in fact wearing Dina's bracelet in that, and that's why I do think it is after the cinematic part of the third trailer that we were given for The Last of Us Part 2, as I believe that Dina either gave it to her or Ellie took it from Dina, which then leads me to conclude that the final part of the timeline that we know so far, the most recent that we can get, is the first Last of Us Part 2 trailer that we were given, where Ellie is sat on the bed singing the song Through the Valley, and Joel comes in as this ghost type figure. Again, we don't know for sure if he's alive in this part of The Last of Us Part 2 or he has actually died and he's this ghostly figure, but either way I do believe this is after she's killed the cult because there are dead bodies everywhere and she is just sat in the aftermath playing her guitar. However, I do think it was really hard to judge that one. I do think there are explanations to switch those two around, definitely. I think it could go either way, but those two bits are definitely the most recent that we have in terms of the timeline. So that's basically everything I can think of for the timeline, going from right at the beginning to everything we have now. I hope it was easy enough for you guys to understand. I'll try to edit in a way that it is easy enough for everyone to understand. If you did enjoy this or find it informative or helpful, then be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see any more Last of Us content as we get more revealed about The Last of Us Part 2. If you disagree, agree, or have any more insightful information about what you think the timeline would have actually been up to this point, then be sure to comment it down below. I would love to see your suggestions or pick up on anything that you think I said incorrectly. Any sort of information is super helpful like that to make sure that we have this timeline solidly in our minds, or just at least we can tell what's going to be happening in this new game. I'll leave a link to my previous Last of Us videos in the description below. There's a playlist with some information and some reactions to everything that's happening with The Last of Us Part 2. And just before I go, I would like to say a big thank you for all the support that I got on my previous videos. The reaction one was especially insane, so thank you for all of that and liking. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it, and I hope that this was helpful and that I can continue to produce content that you guys will enjoy. Anyways, I hope to see you soon and have a great day.